Within the broad and wacky world of Unsung Heroes, there are a wide variety of purposes which many of these vehicles have. Some of them are just to make it because they can, or to show off what a manufacturer can do. Others have a goal in mind, be it to break a record or win a race using some less conventional means. The ones which are always the most humorous to me, though, are those cars that are generally ground-up creations to advertise a seemingly unrelated or semi-related product of some kind, and this is sort of one of those examples. See, back in the 1980s, the very early 80s, the boss of Wolfrace, who of course make alloy wheels, called Barry Tracy, wanted a vehicle built which would showcase this new line of Sonic alloys. Alloys which you'll see on this vehicle, and which those of you who are fans of the 80s British car scene might also recognise from the XR2 Fiesta, the 2.8 litre Ford Capri, and even the 1300 Metro. He wanted a car that would do more than a billboard could, something that would stick in people's minds, but also that wasn't just a rolling piece of plastic with a wooden block instead of an engine. This was a real road-legal, drivable custom creation. So he enlisted the help of a chap called Nick Butler. Now, Nick Butler came from an aviation background within the engineering sphere. He worked on the Harrier jump jets, the Hawk airplanes, on the testing side of things. In 1976, though, he left that and set up his brand Auto Imagination to create custom and special vehicles, which was also a passion of his. So these two guys had whatever talks they would have had at the time, and he developed this vehicle. Now, two of these were originally built, and they have an interesting history of changing hands through the years. Now, as you can kind of tell, it has two separate engines. Now, these are each Rover V8s. Both exactly the same, as you'd kind of hope. It has two separate automatic gearboxes linked to the rear axle and the diff from a Jag. So, of course, it can cope with the kind of power and torque that it would need to put down, and really the only limitation on this car's performance seems to be those choice of gearboxes, Borg-Warner Type 65s, which of course were not uncommon to see in Rovers etc. of the time. 3-speed autos. So not exactly a best of both worlds kind of gearbox, not the quickest for acceleration, but also not the best for top speed either, unfortunately, as you'll see in a second, because these two engines put together meant that this car in 1981 was kind of like a British equivalent of something like a Bugatti Veyron. 7 litres, 16 cylinders, and just over 640 horsepower. Those are some pretty amazing numbers, and it only weighed about 1,500 kilos. With, of course, the majority of that weight coming from having a twin-engine, twin-transmission layout. The body itself was just fiberglass, it was only a 2-seater, the heads-up display was developed by a small German brand, and being rear-wheel drive, there wasn't even any excess weight from a heavy 4-wheel drive or all-wheel drive system. Yet, the quoted or semi-quoted performance, at least from what I could find, doesn't seem as impressive as you might hope. This was certainly no 200-mile-an-hour monster. In fact, the quoted numbers seem to be more like the 7-second 0 to 60 range with a top speed of about 150-160 miles an hour. So not exactly anything to write home about, but again, in 1981 for a one-off creation, which at the end of the day was going to spend most of its time sitting on a platform at car shows, it was good enough, and I'm sure it sounded great, if nothing else. Now, at the time, Autocar tested the vehicle, they had it out on the street, and you can see that in some of the images, even some within this video. One of them was actually resprayed red at a certain point for a Playboy shoot. It was featured at a wide variety of events, it went on that whole Showcar circuit, and was even featured in a British Grand Prix event opening in, I believe, 1984, if the research I found was correct. So it had its kind of 15 minutes of fame and then kind of slipped away a little bit. In the 90s, for example, it was sold to a private collector, and it went into a little bit of a state of disrepair sometime around 2005. Now again, if the research that I found is correct, this car suffered from some colossal depreciation because the initial cost in the early 80s to build them was $100,000, which was of course a huge amount of money, even more so back in around 1980. Then in 2010, that original car was sold for £1 million, which is pretty remarkable for what was just a show car at the end of the day, and hardly the most famous show car ever at that. Then though, it was apparently sold only 5 years later for $18,000. Now, if those two numbers are accurate, and if that time frame is accurate, that is one hell of a lot of depreciation, and apparently the car had been mostly in storage since around 2005 and had fallen into disrepair, needing a basically full restoration, if not close to that. And the owner at the time couldn't afford to do so. So clearly it must have changed hands at some point between those two price amounts, because whoever paid $1 million for it obviously could afford to restore it. So it seems to get a little bit hazy there, and with previous episodes of Unsung Heroes, and I always love it when this happens, you'll occasionally see a random comment drop from someone who knows more information about a project. Maybe they had a family member who was involved. So by all means, if you know someone who was involved, if you know something about this vehicle which I haven't mentioned, then absolutely slap it down in the comments below. And of course, for the casual viewer, it's worth looking down in the comments to see if someone has dropped some of those nuggets of knowledge. So ultimately, it's an interesting marketing approach to sell alloys, but a pretty badass car at the same time. It's a British kind of supercar, kind of hot rod, kind of concept car, but not really. It kind of mixes and blends a number of different genres into one. Certainly supercar specs, but more of a hot rod kind of visual approach and even performance approach. And ultimately, it was a gimmick, quite deliberately, to sell those alloys. And the alloys are pretty famous. So if nothing else, the car does deserve a place, I believe, in this series. It's not the most famous thing around, but that's kind of the point of Unsung Heroes. So ultimately, that's it for this installment. Of course, if you're newer to this series, maybe even if this is your first time watching, there are tons more, as you can tell from the number on this episode, well over 100 other episodes to check out. And of course, stick around on the channel for more. But that's it for this installment. I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.